In the harsh Wyoming territory of 1,896, a wealthy cattle baron places a simple advertisement for a housekeeper. Barrett Hale expects to hire one quiet woman to manage his isolated stone lodge. Instead, he finds himself face to face with Miriam and Ruth Tisdale, identical twin sisters, who've lost everything in a mining tragedy that claimed both their husbands. What begins as a practical arrangement soon transforms into something neither the hardened rancher nor the grieving sisters could have imagined. The twins bring warmth to rooms that have stood cold for years, filling Barrett's fortress-like home with the scents of fresh bread and forgotten melodies. But as winter deepens and the outside world grows suspicious of the unusual household, old wounds begin to heal in unexpected ways. What happens when three broken souls discover that sometimes the family you choose matters more than the one you're born into? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind carved through the valleys of Wyoming territory with the sharp edge of winter's promise, carrying the scent of snow from the distant peaks. Barrett Hale stood at the tall windows of his stone lodge, watching the last golden leaves surrender to the relentless gusts. At 57, he had built an empire from nothing: 10,000 head of cattle, 40,000 acres of prime grazing land, and this monument to his success, a fortress of grey stone that commanded the valley like a medieval keep. The lodge sprawled across a natural shelf of rock, its walls thick enough to withstand both Wyoming winters and the loneliness that had settled into Barrett's bones like an old ache. 3 stories of carefully fitted stone rose from the foundation he had laid with his own hands 12 years ago, each block placed with the precision of a man who understood that permanence required perfect planning. The windows were tall and numerous, designed to let in light, yet somehow the house remained dim, as if the very walls had absorbed his solitude. Inside, the great room stretched 40 feet from the massive stone fireplace to the mahogany staircase that curved upward toward empty bedrooms. Persian rugs lay scattered across polished oak floors, their rich colors muted by dust and disuse. A crystal chandelier hung from the coffered ceiling, most of its candles never lit, casting fragments of light that danced alone in the perpetual twilight of Barrett's self-imposed exile. He kept the essential room-she's study, his bedroom, the kitchen, but the rest of the house echoed with the hollow sound of a life half-lived. The dining room's long table hadn't hosted a proper meal in a decade. The music room stood silent, its grand piano gathering dust like a monument to joy he could no longer feel. Even the servants' quarters remained empty. Barrett had long ago dismissed the staff, preferring the company of cattle and horses to the complicated presence of human beings. This morning, however, something would change, though Barrett couldn't yet know it. In his leather-bound desk drawer, beneath layers of ranch documents and forgotten correspondence, lay a simple gold band, his late wife's wedding ring. He hadn't looked at it in months, but it remained there like an anchor to grief, holding him fast to a pain that had become as familiar as breathing. Margaret had been gone 10 years now, claimed by the fever that swept through the territory in the winter of 1,886. She had died in their bed upstairs, in the room Barrett now avoided, her final words a whispered promise that she would wait for him somewhere beyond the veil of sorrow. He had never remarried, never even considered it. How could he, when her absence filled every corner of this house he had built as a shrine to their love? The cattle empire had grown in the years since her death, fed by his need to stay busy, to avoid the silence that crept into unguarded moments. He rose before dawn, rode fence lines until sunset, counted profits with the methodical precision of a man who had forgotten how to count blessings. His foreman, Joe Garrett, handled most of the daily operations now, but Barrett still made the rounds, still checked every gate and water source, still pushed himself until exhaustion promised dreamless sleep. The advertisement had been Joe's idea, really. "Boss," the grizzled cowhand had said just last week, "you can't keep living like a hermit in that big house. You need someone to keep it proper, cook decent meals, make sure you don't waste away to nothing." Barrett had resisted, but even he could see the logic. The lodge was too large for one man to maintain, and his own cooking consisted mainly of beans and hardtack, hardly fitting for a man of his station. So he had placed the notice in the Cheyenne Leader and the Laramie Boomerang. Housekeeper wanted for gentleman's ranch, discretion required, excellent wages, comfortable quarters. Apply Barrett Hale, Stone Creek Lodge, Bear Valley. Simple, direct, offering enough money to attract serious applicants but not so much as to draw fortune hunters. He expected perhaps half a dozen responses, widows mostly, women past their prime, looking for steady work and a roof over their heads. He had not expected the letter that arrived yesterday morning, written in careful copperplate script on paper that smelled faintly of lavender. Dear Mr. Hale, we write in response to your advertisement seeking household assistance. We are Miriam and Ruth Tisdale, recently of the Sweetwater Mining District, and find ourselves in need of honest employment. We are twins, both widowed in recent circumstances, and have considerable experience in domestic management. We understand this may be an unusual arrangement, but we work as a team and require only modest accommodation. We can provide references from our previous situation and are available to begin employment immediately. Respectfully yours, Mrs. Miriam Tisdale and Mrs. Ruth Tisdale. Barrett had read the letter 3 times, puzzled by the phrase, both widowed in recent circumstances. What were the odds of twin sisters losing their husbands in close succession? Still, the letter was well written, respectful, and the women sounded desperate enough to be reliable. Desperation, in Barrett's experience, made for loyal employees. He had sent word for them to come for an interview, expecting to hire one and politely dismiss the other. But as he stood at his window this morning, watching the dust cloud that marked an approaching wagon, Barrett found himself curious about these mysterious twin widows from the mining camps. The wagon that emerged from the cottonwoods along Stone Creek was simple but well maintained, drawn by a matched pair of chestnuts that showed good care, despite their road-worn appearance. The driver was a woman, her hands steady on the reins, and beside her sat another figure, so identical that Barrett had to look twice to convince himself he wasn't seeing double. Miriam and Ruth Tisdale were not young women. Barrett judged them to be past 60, but they carried themselves with the dignity of those who had faced hardship without surrendering their pride. Both wore traveling dresses of dark blue wool, practical but well-tailored, and identical black bonnets that framed faces so alike it was unsettling. Only their eyes showed the difference. One pair held a spark of quiet determination, while the other carried a sadness deep as winter wells. They climbed down from the wagon with practiced efficiency, gathering their small bags and a few personal items with the economy of movement that spoke of recent upheaval. Barrett found himself studying them from behind the curtain, these two women who moved like mirror images of each other, finishing each other's actions with the unconscious precision of decades together. The knock at his door was firm but not demanding. Barrett straightened his collar, checked his appearance in the hall mirror, and opened the heavy oak door to find himself face to face with his unexpected applicants. Mr. Hale? The woman on the left spoke first, her voice carrying the slight accent of the East, perhaps Pennsylvania or Ohio. I am Mrs. Miriam Tisdale, and this is my sister, Ruth Tisdale. We've come about the position you advertised. Barrett nodded, stepping back to allow them entrance. Please, come in. I received your letter. They entered with careful steps, their eyes taking in the grandeur of the great room with expressions that revealed both appreciation and something like pity. Barrett saw his home suddenly through their eyes, the magnificent space, empty of life, the cold fireplace, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light like ghosts of better times. You have a beautiful home, Mr. Hale. Ruth said, her voice softer than her sister's, musical in a way that suggested she might once have sung lullabies to children who were no longer there to hear them. It serves its purpose, Barrett replied, then cleared his throat. Please, sit. We should discuss the position. They settled onto the leather sofa with identical movements, their hands folded in their laps, their backs straight, despite what had clearly been a long journey. Barrett took the chair across from them, studying these women who had answered his call for help. "Your letter mentioned recent widowhood," he began carefully. "I hope you don't mind my asking. The Sweetwater mine collapse?" Miriam said simply. "6 weeks ago, 17 men lost, including our husbands. Jacob and Samuel were brothers, you see. We've all been family for over 30 years. The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Barrett felt the familiar weight of shared grief, the recognition of loss that needed no explanation. These women understood the hollow echo of empty rooms, the way silence could become its own form of company. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, meaning it. "Mining is dangerous work." "Yes, it is," Ruth agreed quietly. "But it was good work for good men. Jacob was a shift supervisor, Samuel a timber boss. They kept the other miners safe for 15 years until," her voice caught slightly, "until the day they couldn't keep themselves safe." Barrett nodded. He understood the way tragedy could arrive without warning, upending lives with the arbitrary cruelty of fate. "And now you find yourselves in need of employment." "We do," Miriam confirmed. "The mine company provided a small settlement, enough to see us through winter if we're careful. But we're not women to sit idle. We need work, Mr. Hale, honest work that gives purpose to our days." "The advertisement mentioned discretion," Ruth added. "We understand you value your privacy. We're not gossips, Mr. Hale. We've learned that some griefs are too deep for casual conversation." Barrett found himself appreciating their directness. These were women who had lived full lives, who understood that some wounds never fully healed, but could be managed with dignity and work. "The position involves managing the household cooking, cleaning, basic maintenance. The house is large, but I live simply. I keep early hours, rise before dawn, often don't return until sunset." "We're early risers ourselves," Miriam said. 30 years of mining camp life doesn't allow for late mornings." "Can you cook?" Barrett asked. "I can," Miriam replied with the first hint of warmth he'd seen from her. "Bread, roasts, vegetables, preserves, all the substantial cooking a working man needs. Ruth handles the finer touches, pastries, cakes when there's cause for celebration. And cleaning? Between us, we can manage any household," Ruth assured him. "We're thorough but respectful of personal space. We understand the difference between tidiness and intrusion." Barrett considered them both, these twin widows who sat in his empty house like two sides of the same coin, practical, one gentle, both carrying the weight of recent loss with quiet dignity. He had intended to hire one housekeeper, not two, but something about their obvious devotion to each other, their careful way of speaking as a unit while maintaining their individuality, made him reconsider. "The wages I offered were for one person," he said slowly. "We understand," Miriam replied. "We're prepared to share the wage between us, with room and board. We don't require separate quarters. We've shared a home all our lives." Barrett looked around his vast, empty house and made a decision that surprised him. "I'll pay each of you 3/4 of the advertised wage. You'll share the large bedroom on the second floor. It has its own sitting area and fireplace. Meals are at dawn, noon, and sunset. Sundays are your own time. Does this arrangement suit you?" The twins exchanged a glance, the first, purely emotional moment Barrett had witnessed between them. Relief, gratitude, and something deeper passed between their identical faces before Miriam turned back to him. "It suits us very well, Mr. Hale. When would you like us to begin?" "Tomorrow morning," Barrett said, standing. "I'll show you to your room now, if you'd like to settle in." As he led them up the curved staircase, Barrett found himself wondering what he had just done. For 10 years, this house had been his refuge from the world, a place where grief could echo undisturbed through empty halls. Now he was inviting two strangest women who knew their own measure of sorrow to share his solitude. Perhaps, he thought as he opened the door to what had once been intended as a guest suite, it was time for the echoes to have some company. Barrett woke before dawn to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his house. For a moment, he lay still in his bed, listening to the soft footsteps on the stairs, the gentle clink of dishes, the whisper of a woman's voice, speaking too quietly to distinguish words. Then memory returned. The Tisdale sisters had been in residence for 3 days now, and already his ordered solitude had been transformed. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on his usual work clothes with hands that had performed this ritual 10,000 times before. But as he descended the stairs, he caught a scent that stopped him. Mid-step coffee, yes, but also something else. Something warm and yeasty and alive that spoke of kitchens where families gathered, of mornings that held more promise than mere survival. In the kitchen, he found Miriam kneading dough at the long wooden table, her sleeves rolled up to reveal arms still strong, despite her 61 years. She looked up as he entered, flour dusting her dark dress, a small smile creasing the corners of her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. Coffee's ready, and there'll be fresh biscuits in 20 minutes if you can wait." Barrett poured his coffee from the pot that sat warming on the stove knot, the thin, bitter brew he usually managed for himself, but something rich and dark that spoke of careful attention. "You didn't need to go to such trouble." "It's no trouble," Miriam replied, continuing her rhythmic kneading. "Ruth and I have been up for an hour. Old habits from the mining camp, the men needed feeding before their shifts." Through the kitchen window, Barrett could see Ruth in what had been the music room, running a cloth over the piano's dusty surface. She moved with the careful reverence of someone who understood the value of beautiful things, even abandoned ones. "She plays?" Barrett asked, nodding toward the window. "Beautifully," Miriam said with obvious pride. "Taught herself as a girl, then taught the children at the mining camp. Music was scarce in those places, but Ruth could make magic with any instrument she touched." Barrett watched Ruth work, something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. The piano had been Margaret's a wedding gift he'd had shipped from Denver at considerable expense. She had played it every evening, filling the house with melodies that seemed to make the very walls breathe with contentment. After her death, Barrett had closed the music room door and never opened it again. "She doesn't need to clean in there," he said quietly. Miriam's hands stilled on the dough. "I'll tell her, if you prefer." Barrett started to say yes, to restore the familiar barriers that had protected him from memories too sharp to bear. But something in Miriam's careful tone, the way she waited without judgment for his decision, made him pause. "No," he said finally. "No, it's fine. The room should be cleaned." When he returned that evening, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The great room, which had felt cavernous and cold for so long, seemed somehow smaller, more intimate. A fire crackled in the massive stone hearthnot, the meager flames Barrett usually managed, but a proper blaze that threw dancing shadows across the Persian rugs. The dust was gone from every surface, the windows gleamed clean, and the smell of fresh bread lingered in the air like a benediction. But it was the sound that affected him most. As he hung his coat in the hall closet, he could hear it drifting from the music, room piano music, played with a touch so gentle it seemed to apologize for disturbing the silence. Ruth was playing something simple, a melody that spoke of autumn evenings and the comfort of home. Not one of Margaret's favorite pieces, but something that honored the instrument without claiming ownership of its memories. Barrett stood in the hallway, his hand still on the closet door, listening to music in his house for the first time in 10 years. His chest felt tight, as if he'd forgotten how to breathe properly, but he didn't move away. Instead, he found himself walking toward the music room, drawn by sounds that awakened something he'd thought permanently buried. Ruth sat at the piano bench, her posture straight, her fingers moving over the keys with the confidence of long practice. She had changed from her traveling dress into something simpler, a grey wool dress, with a white collar that made her look less formal, more like someone who belonged in a kitchen or a parlor, rather than standing at the edge of other people's lives. She must have sensed his presence because she looked up, her hands stilling on the keys. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "Miriam said you didn't mind, but if I'm disturbing—" "You're not disturbing anything," Barrett said, surprised by the hoarseness in his own voice. "I haven't heard music in this house for 10 years. Ruth's face softened with understanding. "Your wife played?" "Every evening." The words came out before he could stop them, carrying more pain than he'd intended to reveal. She said music made a house into a home. She was right, Ruth said gently. May I ask, what did she prefer to play? Barrett found himself stepping into the room, moving closer to the piano, where Margaret had spent so many evenings. Chopin mostly, some Bach. She had a particular fondness for nocturnes, said they matched the way the light fell across the mountains at sunset. Ruth nodded, her fingers finding the keys again, picking out a melody so soft it was barely audible. I don't know much Chopin, she admitted. My repertoire runs more to hymns and folk songs, music for people who needed comfort more than culture. What were you playing when I came in? Something I learned from a Welsh miner's wife. She said it reminded her of home, of valleys green with rain and sheep scattered across the hillsides like clouds. Ruth played a few more notes, the melody sweet and slightly melancholy. I thought it suited this room all, this space, waiting to be filled with something beautiful. Barrett sat heavily in the chair that had been Margaret's favorite listening spot, the leather creaking under his weight. From here, he had watched his wife's hands dance across the keys, had seen the way music seemed to flow through her, like water finding its natural course. Now he watched Ruth's different touchless, polished perhaps, but no less meaningful, and felt something crack inside his chest. The mining camp must have been hard, he said, needing to speak of something other than his own ghosts. Hard, yes, but not without its compensations, Ruth replied, her hands continuing their gentle exploration of the keys. There's something about a place where everyone struggles together. It creates bonds you don't find in easier circumstances. The women looked after each other's children. The men shared their knowledge to keep everyone safe. When someone was hurt or sick, the whole camp rallied around them. And when someone died, Ruth's hands stilled. Then we grieved together too. 17 families lost everything in that collapse, Mr. Hale. For a while it seemed like the grief might swallow us all. But somehow, sharing it made it bearable. Barrett thought of his own grief, hoarded and protected like a miser's gold, never shared, never lessened by companionship. I'm not sure I know how to do that. Share grief, I mean. Perhaps, Ruth said quietly. It's not something you learn all at once. Perhaps it starts with just allowing other people to sit with you while you remember. That night, Barrett lay awake, listening to the sounds of a house that was no longer empty. The Tisdale sisters moved quietly, respectfully, but their presence changed everything. He could hear water running in the kitchen as they cleaned the dinner dishes, the soft murmur of their voices as they settled into their shared room, the creak of floorboards as they moved through their evening routines. For 10 years, silence had been his companion, but now he found it replaced by the gentle rhythms of domestic life. It should have felt like an intrusion, but instead it felt like something he'd forgotten. He was missing the simple comfort of knowing he wasn't alone in the world. The next morning brought news that would shake the foundations of Barrett's carefully constructed solitude. Joe Garrett arrived at the house before dawn, his face grim beneath the brim of his worn hat. "Boss, we got trouble," he said without preamble. "Riders came through last night asking questions about the property lines up near Willow Creek, said they were representing some kind of investment group out of Cheyenne." Barrett poured coffee for both of them, his mind already working through the implications. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests someone's been looking at our water rights real careful like. They wanted to know about the original survey markers, about whether we had clear title to the springs that feed the creek. Of course we do. I filed those claims myself 15 years ago. That's what I told them, Joe said, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. But they seemed mighty interested in the fact that you've been running cattle up there without any permanent structures, said something about adverse possession and prior claims. Barrett felt the familiar coldness that had served him well in business dealings, the ice-water calm that came when his empire was threatened. Did they give names? Fellow called himself Carson, said he represented the Territorial Development Company. Slick-talking city type, but he had hard men with him, the kind that make their living with guns rather than conversation. From the kitchen came the sound of Miriam preparing breakfast, the domestic normalcy, a sharp contrast to the threat that had arrived with the dawn. Barrett found himself thinking not just of his land and cattle, but of the two women who had just begun to make his house feel like a home again. "Double the watch on the North Range," he told Joe. "And send word to Tom Morrison in Cheyenne. I want him to check every filing and claim we have on record. If someone's planning to challenge our title, I want to know about it before they make their move." As Joe rode back toward the bunkhouse, Barrett stood at his window watching the sun rise over the mountains that had been his sanctuary for so many years. The land stretched out before him, golden in the morning light. But for the first time since Margaret's death, he felt the weight of responsibility for more than just his own grief. Inside the house, he could hear Ruth playing piano, something livelier than yesterday's melancholy tune, a melody that spoke of resilience and the stubborn courage required to face another day. In the kitchen, Miriam hummed along as she worked, their voices weaving together in unconscious harmony. Barrett realized with startling clarity that he had something to lose again, something worth fighting for beyond mere pride or profit. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it felt like the first warmth he'd experienced in a decade of winter. The sourdough starter sat on the windowsill like a patient pet, its surface bubbling with life that Miriam tended with the devotion of a mother. She had carried it with her from the mining camp, this culture of wild yeast and flour that had fed her family for 30 years, and now it served as the foundation for transformation in Barrett's kitchen. 47 years old this starter is, she told Ruth as she measured flour into the ceramic crock. "My mother gave it to me as a wedding gift, and her mother gave it to her before that. Some things survive, because they're meant to, I suppose." Barrett paused in the kitchen doorway, watching Miriam work with the easy competence of someone who had never questioned the value of simple, essential tasks. She had been in his house for a week now, and already the rhythm of domestic life had begun to establish itself around her presence. The morning coffee was always ready before he woke, rich and dark and perfectly brewed. Fresh bread appeared on the table with the reliability of sunrise, and the evening meals had evolved from his usual beans and hardtack to substantial fare that reminded him what it meant to be properly nourished. "You don't have to make bread every day," he said, entering the kitchen. "I can buy what I need in town." Miriam looked up from her work, flour dusting her hands. "Store-bought bread is fine for some purposes, Mr. Hale, but it doesn't have the substance a man needs for hard work. Besides," she added with a small smile, "the starter needs feeding whether I make bread or not. Might as well put it to good use." Barrett poured his coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching her hands shape the dough with practiced efficiency. There was something mesmerizing about the process, the way she folded and pressed, reading the texture with her fingertips, adding flour or water with the instinct of long experience. It reminded him of his own work with leather, the way good craftsmanship became second nature after decades of practice. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "My mother, mostly, but also from other women in the camps. You learn to make do with what's available, to stretch ingredients when money's tight, to feed a crowd when someone's family needs help." She paused in her kneading, her expression growing thoughtful. "Ruth and I, we never had children of our own. The Lord didn't see fit to bless us that way. But in the mining camps, we were aunts to dozens of little ones. Their mothers taught me their family recipes, and I taught them mine." Barrett tried to imagine these two women in the rough environment of a mining camp, bringing order and comfort to families, scraping out a living from dangerous work. It painted a picture of quiet heroism, of lives lived in service to others, without expectation of recognition or reward. "You miss it," he observed. "Parts of it," Miriam admitted. "I miss the feeling of being useful, of knowing that what I did mattered to people I cared about. But I don't miss the worry lying, awake at night, listening for the mine whistle, wondering if this would be the day something went wrong." From the music room came the sound of piano music, a gentle melody that seemed to complement the domestic scene in the kitchen. Ruth had taken to playing every morning after breakfast, her fingers finding familiar tunes that filled the house with warmth Barrett had forgotten it could hold. "She's getting bolder with her playing," Barrett noted. "She's testing the boundaries," Miriam said, with the insight of someone who had lived alongside another person for 61 years. "Ruth has always been the more tentative of us. She needs to feel welcome before she'll let herself be comfortable." "And you?" Miriam's hands stilled on the dough. "I've learned that comfort is a luxury we can't always afford. Sometimes you have to make yourself useful first and hope acceptance follows." Barrett found himself studying this woman who had walked into his kitchen and transformed it from a place of mere sustenance into something that felt like the heart of a home. She was not conventionally beautiful. Her face was too angular, her hair too severely pulled back, but there was something compelling about her quiet competence, her refusal to apologize for taking up space in the world. "You're welcome here," he said, the words coming out more formally than he intended. "Both of you. I should have said that sooner." Miriam looked up from her work, her eyes meeting his directly. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. That means more than you might realize." The morning routine continued to evolve around them. Barrett would eat his breakfast of fresh biscuits and eggs, strong coffee, and sometimes bacon if the sisters had been to town for supplies. He would discuss the day's work with Joe Garrett, who had taken to joining them for the morning meal, drawn by the promise of food that bore no resemblance to bunkhouse fare. "Ma'am," Joe would say to Miriam each morning, touching his hat brim with the respect due to a woman who could turn flour and water into something approaching heaven. "You sure know your way around a kitchen." "Thank you, Joe," Miriam would reply, already bustling about the task of feeding working men. "There's more coffee if you want it, and don't be shy about the biscuits." Barrett found himself lingering over these morning meals, reluctant to leave the warmth of the kitchen for the cold business of cattle and land management. There was something addictive about the easy conversation, the way Miriam anticipated needs before they were voiced, the background music of Ruth's piano filtering through the house like a benevolent presence. But the world beyond the kitchen windows was not as peaceful as the domestic scene within. The riders Joe had mentioned continued to appear on Barrett's land, always careful to stay just within the bounds of legal access, always polite when confronted but persistent in their questions about property lines and water rights. "They came by the south pasture yesterday," Joe reported one morning. "3 of them this time, with surveying equipment. When I asked what they were doing, they said they were updating county records." "The county didn't send them," Barrett said grimly. "I checked with the assessor's office yesterday. Someone's planning something, and they're being careful to make it look official." Miriam listened to this exchange with the careful attention of someone who had lived through uncertainty before. "Is the ranch in danger?" she asked quietly. "Not if I can help it," Barrett replied, but he could see the worry in her eyes. These women had already lost one home to circumstances beyond their control. The thought of them facing that kind of upheaval again made something protective and fierce rise in his chest. That afternoon, Barrett rode to town with purpose. Cheyenne was 3 hours away, but the smaller settlement of Bear Creek served the immediate needs of the local ranchers. He found Sheriff William Donovan in his office, a man Barrett had known since the territory's early days. "Bill, I need to know what you've heard about the Territorial Development Company." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Heard of them, sure enough. They've been buying up water rights throughout the territory, mostly from folks who don't realize what they're signing away. Legal as Sunday, but it leaves a bad taste. And if someone wanted to challenge an existing claim, depends on the strength of the original filing. But Barrett, you've got one of the most solid claims in the territory. You filed before statehood, paid your fees, marked your boundaries proper. What's got you worried?" Barrett explained about the riders and their interest in his northern range. Donovan listened with the attention of a man who had seen too many good ranchers lose their land to clever lawyers and questionable business practices. "I'll keep my ears open," the sheriff promised. "But you might want to think about getting yourself a good lawyer just in case. Tom Morrison's honest, and he knows territorial law better than most." On the ride home, Barrett found himself thinking not just about the threat to his land, but about the two women who had made his house feel like more than just a shelter. The thought of losing them, of returning to the echoing emptiness that had defined his life for so long, was more disturbing than any business concern. When he reached the lodge, he could smell dinner cooking before he even dismounted. The windows glowed warm against the gathering dusk, and the sound of voices, Miriam's practical alto and Ruth's softer tones, drifted out to greet him. It was a scene of domestic contentment that he had never expected to experience again. Inside, he found the dining room table set for three, candles lit despite the early hour. Miriam emerged from the kitchen, carrying a roast that filled the room with savory aromas, while Ruth followed with vegetables and fresh bread, still warm from the oven. "We thought we'd eat in the dining room tonight," Miriam said. "It seemed a shame to let such a beautiful room go unused." Barrett looked around the formal dining room, with its long mahogany table and crystal chandelier, its walls lined with paintings of pastoral scenes. He had not eaten here since Margaret's death, had taken all his meals in the kitchen or his study, treating the dining room like a museum of better times. "It's been a long time," he said quietly. "Perhaps that's what makes tonight special," Ruth suggested, her voice gentle but sure. "Sometimes the best way to honor a room is to fill it with life again." As they sat down to dinner, Barrett realized that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with his own home. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum to his grief, but like a place where new memories could be made alongside the old ones. The sisters had not erased Margaret's presence, they had simply made room for life to continue around it. "This is delicious," he said, tasting the roast. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Trial and error mostly," Miriam replied. 40 years of feeding working men teaches you to make the most of simple ingredients." Barrett found himself relaxing into the easy rhythm of conversation, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people who had become more than employees. For the first time in years, he felt like he was living in his own home rather than simply occupying it. Ruth's sheet music collection occupied a place of honor on top of the piano, each piece carefully preserved despite years of handling and the rough conditions of mining camp life. The papers were yellowed at the edges and some bore water stains from leaky cabin roofs, but the notes remained clear, testament to music that had provided comfort in places where beauty was scarce. Barrett discovered the collection on an evening when rain drummed against the windows, and he found himself drawn to the music room by the sound of Ruth practicing. She sat at the piano with her back straight, her fingers moving over a piece that seemed more complex than her usual simple melodies. "What are you playing?" he asked from the doorway. Ruth looked up, her cheeks slightly flushed with concentration. "Something I learned from a German miner's daughter. She taught piano lessons to the children in camp, and this was one of her favorites. It's called Evening Song." She said it reminded her of her homeland. "It's beautiful," Barrett said, moving closer to examine the sheet music scattered across the piano's music stand. "You have quite a collection here." "Each piece tells a story," Ruth explained, her fingers continuing to pick out the gentle melody. "This one came from Mrs. Chen, whose husband worked the deep shafts. She sang it while she washed clothes, said it helped her not worry about cave-ins. And this," she picked up another sheet, "was written by a cowboy who spent winters in the camps. He said it captured the loneliness of the prairie." Barrett found himself fascinated by this musical chronicle of rough places and hard lives. Each sheet of music represented not just notes on paper, but moments when someone had chosen beauty over despair, harmony over the chaos of dangerous work and uncertain futures. "Do you read music, Mr. Hale?" Ruth asked. "A little. Margaret tried to teach me, but I never had the patience for it." The admission came easier than it once had, the pain of memory softened by time and the gentle presence of someone who understood loss. "It's never too late to learn," Ruth said diplomatically. "Music has a way of speaking to people when they're ready to hear it." Over the following days, Barrett began to spend more time in the music room, drawn by the combination of Ruth's playing and his own curiosity about the collection. He learned that she had taught herself to read music as a young woman, practicing on whatever instruments she could find: an old pump organ in a church, a saloon piano during the quiet afternoon hours, even a harmonica when nothing else was available. "Music was my refuge," she explained one evening as she sorted through the sheets, organizing them by difficulty and mood. When Jacob and Samuel worked the dangerous shifts, when the mine owners cut wages or the company store raised prices, when winter seemed to last forever, music was the one thing that couldn't be taken away. Barrett watched her handle each sheet with reverence, understanding that she was preserving more than just songs. These were the remnants of a community that had been destroyed, the cultural memory of people who had found ways to create beauty in the midst of hardship. "The mining camp must have had quite a musical tradition," he observed. "Oh, it did," Ruth said, her face lighting up with memory. "Saturday nights, if the men weren't too tired, we'd have gatherings in the main hall. Someone would play fiddle, another would bring a guitar, and I'd accompany on whatever piano we could borrow from the saloon. The children would dance, and the adults would sing songs from their homelands. German waltzes, Irish ballads, songs in languages I couldn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones." Barrett tried to imagine these two refined women in such rough surroundings, bringing culture and grace to places where survival was the primary concern. It painted a picture of quiet heroism that impressed him more than any battlefield courage. "You miss it," he said. "I miss the sense of community," Ruth admitted. "Everyone looking out for everyone else, sharing what little we had, celebrating the small victories together. But I don't miss the constant worry, the knowledge that any day could bring disaster." That worry had proven justified, Barrett knew. The mine collapse that had claimed their husbands and ended their life in the camps was exactly the kind of tragedy that had haunted their daily existence for 30 years. "What will you do with the music?" he asked. Ruth looked at the scattered sheets with something like sadness. "I suppose I'll continue to play them, to keep the songs alive. Music dies when it's not heard, you know. These pieces represent the voices of people who deserve to be remembered." An idea began to form in Barrett's mind, something that surprised him with its generosity. "Would you consider giving piano lessons?" Ruth looked up sharply. "Lessons? There are children in Bear Creek who might benefit from music instruction. The school teacher mentioned it once how the children have no exposure to culture beyond what their families can provide." Barrett found himself warming to the idea as he spoke. "You could offer lessons on Saturday afternoons or during the week if their parents can spare them from chores." Ruth seemed taken aback by the suggestion. "I don't know if I'm qualified to teach properly. I'm not a trained musician." "You're someone who understands music's power to comfort and inspire," Barrett said firmly. "That might be more valuable than formal training." That evening at dinner, Ruth raised the subject with Miriam, seeking her sister's counsel as she had clearly done for 6 decades. "What do you think?" Ruth asked. "Barrett, Mr. Hale thinks I might offer piano lessons to the children in town." Miriam considered this while cutting her meat, her face thoughtful. "It would give you a purpose beyond housekeeping, which I think you need, and it would connect us to the community in a positive way." "What do you mean, connect us to the community?" Barrett answered before Miriam could speak. "There's been talk in town about the arrangement here, about 2 women living in a bachelor's household. Teaching their children might help establish your reputation as respectable members of the community." Ruth's cheeks colored slightly. "I hadn't thought about how it might look." "People talk," Miriam said pragmatically. "They always have and always will, but it's harder to gossip about someone who's doing good work for your children." The conversation continued through dessert apple pie. Made from fruit Ruth had preserved herself from the wild trees near Stone Creek. Barrett found himself enjoying not just the food, but the easy discussion of plans and possibilities. It had been years since he'd participated in conversations about the future rather than simply managing the present. "There's something else to consider," he said as Ruth poured coffee. "If you're going to teach piano, you'll need a better instrument than the one in the music room." Both sisters looked at him with surprise. "What's wrong with the piano?" Ruth asked. "Nothing that can't be fixed, but it hasn't been tuned in 10 years. The climate here is hard on instruments, the dry air, the temperature changes. It needs attention from someone who knows what they're doing. That would be expensive, Miriam said carefully. It would be an investment, Barrett corrected. In the instrument, in your future, in the community. He paused, then added with unusual diffidence, Margaret would have liked the idea of children learning music in this house. The next morning brought unexpected validation of Barrett's concerns about community opinion. Sheriff Donovan arrived just after breakfast, his manner more formal than usual. Barrett, I need to ask you about your household arrangements, he said without preamble. What about them? There's been complaints, folks saying it's not proper, 2 unmarried women living alone with a single man. The church ladies are particularly exercised about it. Barrett felt his temper rise. The church ladies can mind their own business. I agree with you, Donovan said quickly, but I had to ask. There's some who think the territorial governor should be informed that it reflects poorly on the community's moral standards. What exactly are they suggesting? That the arrangement is improper, that you're taking advantage of 2 desperate women, that, Donovan looked uncomfortable, that you're keeping them for purposes other than housekeeping. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, acrid and offensive. Barrett felt his face flush with anger, but before he could speak, Miriam appeared in the kitchen doorway. Sheriff Donovan, she said with quiet dignity, I couldn't help but overhear. Perhaps I can address these concerns directly. She entered the room with Ruth close behind her, both women carrying themselves with the poise of people who had faced adversity without surrendering their self-respect. My sister and I are widows in need of honest employment, Miriam continued. Mr. Hale has provided that employment under entirely respectable circumstances. We have our own quarters, we conduct ourselves with propriety, and our work is exactly what was advertised managing his household. I believe you, ma'am, Donovan said respectfully. But the talk continues, and I thought you should know. Ruth stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. Sheriff, would it help if we became more active in the community? I'm considering offering piano lessons to the local children. It might demonstrate our commitment to contributing positively to the area. Donovan's face brightened. That's an excellent idea, ma'am. Nothing silences gossip like good works. After the sheriff left, Barrett found himself in the unusual position of wanting to defend these 2 women who had brought such unexpected richness to his life. The thought that small-minded people might drive them away filled him with an anger that surprised him with its intensity. I'm sorry about this, he told them. I should have considered how it might look. There's nothing to apologize for, Miriam said firmly. We're 3 adults making decisions that harm no one and benefit everyone involved. If some people choose to see scandal where none exists, that says more about them than about us. Ruth nodded agreement, but Barrett could see the worry in her eyes. These women had already lost one home to circumstances beyond their control. The thought that they might lose another to the prejudices of narrow minds was intolerable. We'll make this work, he said with more conviction than he felt. The piano lessons are a good start. And I'll make sure everyone in Bear Creek understands that you're valued members of this household and this community. As the sisters returned to their work, Barrett stood at his window looking out at the land that had been his refuge for so many years. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had something worth fighting for beyond mere pride or profit. The question was whether he was strong enough to protect it. The hidden love letters lay tucked beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been Margaret's sewing room, a secret cache that Barrett had forgotten in his decade of deliberate forgetfulness. Ruth discovered them quite by accident while cleaning the room thoroughly for the first time since Margaret's death, a task that Barrett had finally permitted after weeks of the sisters' gentle, persistent care, transforming his fortress of solitude into something approaching a home. Mr. Hale, Ruth called from the doorway of the sewing room, her voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. I think you should see this. Barrett climbed the stairs with reluctance, still uncomfortable with anyone disturbing Margaret's private spaces. But when he reached the room, he found Ruth kneeling beside a section of floor where the boards had warped slightly, revealing a small gap that had caught her cleaning cloth. "I'm sorry," she said, rising to her feet with dusty hands. "I was trying to clean properly, and when I moved the sewing table, I noticed the floorboard was loose. I thought perhaps mice had gotten in, but when I lifted it..." She gestured toward a small wooden box, its lid open to reveal a collection of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Barrett's heart stopped as he recognized his own handwriting on the topmost envelope, addressing letters to "My dearest Margaret" in the formal script he had cultivated as a young man courting the love of his life. "They're love letters," Ruth said softly, "written in your hand, but addressed to her. I think she kept them hidden here, like a treasure." Barrett knelt beside the box, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the bundle of letters. There were dozens of them, spanning the years of their courtship and the early years of their marriage. Letters he had written during cattle drives and business trips, pouring out his heart to the woman who had waited for him in this very room, probably reading them by the window that overlooked the valley they had built together. "She never told me she kept them," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Ruth backed toward the door, understanding that she had stumbled upon something deeply private. "I'll leave you alone with them," she said gently. "No," Barrett said, surprising himself. "Stay, please. He struggled to find words for what he was feeling. "I haven't thought about these letters in years. I'm not sure I can face them alone." Ruth hesitated in the doorway, then moved back into the room, settling into Margaret's old rocking chair, with the careful reverence of someone who understood the weight of memory. Barrett remained kneeling by the box, holding the bundle of letters like a man afraid they might crumble at his touch. The topmost letter was dated June 15, 1878, 3 weeks after their wedding, written during his first cattle drive as a married man. He untied the ribbon with fingers that seemed to belong to someone else, and unfolded the yellowed paper, his own words from 18 years ago staring back at him. "My dearest Margaret," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "3 days into this drive, and already I miss you more than I thought possible. The men tease me about being a new husband, but I don't care. How did I live 28 years without knowing what it meant to have someone to come home to?" Ruth said nothing, but he could feel her listening with the attention of someone who understood the sacred nature of love letters, the way they captured feelings too large for everyday conversation. Barrett read on, his voice growing stronger. "I find myself looking at the mountains we can see from our bedroom window and thinking about you seeing the same peaks from the house. It makes this distance bearable, knowing we're under the same sky, that you're there waiting for me to return to the life we're building together." "She was lucky to have someone who loved her so deeply," Ruth said softly. "I was the lucky one," Barrett replied, moving to the next letter. This one was from later that same year, written during a business trip to Denver. In it, he described his plans for expanding the ranch, his dreams of building a house worthy of the woman he had married, his vision of a future filled with children and laughter and the kind of happiness he had never imagined possible. "Listen to this," he said, finding a passage that made him smile despite the tears gathering in his eyes. "I saw a music box in a shop today, a beautiful thing that plays Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat. I almost bought it for you, but then I remembered you have something better, your own hands on our piano, making music that no craftsman could ever capture in a mechanical toy. When I get home, I want to sit in our parlor and listen to you play until the sun sets behind the mountains." Ruth's own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She saved everyone?" Barrett nodded, overwhelmed by the evidence of Margaret's devotion. He had written hundreds of letters during their 8 years of marriage, some from business trips, others from the line camps during roundup, still others from town when he was delayed by weather or cattle sales. He had never thought about whether she kept them, had simply written because the need to share his thoughts with her was as natural as breathing. "There are dozens here," he said, rifling through the collection. "Letters from our first year, from when we were building the house, from..." His voice caught as he found a letter dated just a month before Margaret's death, written during what had turned out to be his last cattle drive. This letter was different from the earlier ones. written by a man who had learned that love was not just passion and dreams, but daily tenderness and shared burden. In it, he wrote about coming home to find her tending the kitchen garden, about the way she hummed while she worked, about his growing certainty that their love was the kind that would last through any trial. "I never read them after I wrote them," Barrett admitted. "Once they were sent, they belonged to her. I had no idea she was keeping them all." Ruth rose from the rocking chair and moved to the window, looking out at the view that Margaret would have seen while reading these letters. "I think she knew they were treasures," she said. "Evidence of a love that most people never experience." Barrett continued reading, discovering a record of his own heart that he had forgotten. Here was the young man who had dreamed of filling this house with children, who had planned to teach his sons to ranch and his daughters to love the land as much as their parents did. Here was the husband who had noticed every dress Margaret wore, every song she played, every small kindness she showed to neighbors and hired hands alike. "Margaret always said you were a romantic soul hiding behind a practical exterior," Ruth observed. "These letters prove she was right." "You talked about me?" Barrett asked, surprised. Ruth blushed slightly. "Miriam and I knew Margaret before we knew you. She came to the mining camp several times with church ladies, bringing supplies for families in need. She spoke of you often, always, with such love and pride." This revelation stunned Barrett. He had known Margaret was active in charitable work, but he had never realized she had been to the mining camps, or that she had spoken of him to the women who would later come to work in his house. "What did she say?" "That you were the kindest man she had ever known, despite your reputation for being hard in business. That you had built her a palace, but would have been just as happy living in a cabin if it meant being together. That you wrote her letters that made her cry, happy tears." Barrett felt as if he were seeing his marriage from the outside for the first time, understanding how it had appeared to others, rather than just how it had felt from within. Margaret had been proud of him, had spoken of their love as something special enough to share with women she barely knew. She also said, Ruth continued gently, that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped you would find a way to be happy again. She worried about you being alone in this big house with only memories for company. The words hit Barrett like a physical blow. He had spent 10 years believing that his grief was a tribute to Margaret's memory, that his isolation honored their love. To learn that she had feared exactly this outcome, that she had wanted him to find happiness again, shattered something fundamental in his understanding of himself. "I thought," he began, then stopped, unable to articulate the confusion of guilt and relief warring in his chest. "You thought that loving someone new would dishonor her memory," Ruth said, with the insight of someone who had wrestled with similar demons. "But love isn't a finite resource, Mr. Hale. Having more of it doesn't diminish what came before." Barrett looked around the sewing room, seeing it differently now that he understood Margaret had used it as a shrine to their correspondence. She had sat in this chair, reading his letters, probably more than once, treasuring the words he had written in hotel rooms and line camps and train stations across the territory. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to move forward without feeling like I'm betraying what we had." "Perhaps," Ruth suggested gently, "you start by accepting that she would want you to be happy. That love given freely, whether to Margaret's memory or to new people in your life, isn't betrayal but fulfillment." As if summoned by their conversation, Miriam appeared in the doorway, her face carefully neutral as she took in the scene of Barrett, surrounded by letters, and Ruth standing by the window, like a guardian of difficult truths. "I wondered where everyone had gone," she said. "Ruth, the bread needs checking, and Mr. Hale, Joe Garrett, is downstairs, asking about the north pasture fence." The practical concerns of daily life intruded on the emotional revelations, but Barrett felt oddly grateful for the interruption. He needed time to absorb what he had learned, to reconcile the man who had written these passionate letters with the hermit he had become. "I'll put these back," he said, beginning to return the letters to their hiding place. "Why?" Ruth asked. "They're your letters, your words. Why hide them away again?" Barrett paused, the bundle of letters in his hands. "Where else would I keep them?" Somewhere you can read them when you want to remember, Miriam suggested from the doorway. Somewhere that honors both the love they represent and the man who wrote them. That evening, Barrett placed the letters in his study, in the same desk drawer where he kept Margaret's wedding ring. But instead of hiding them beneath other papers, he put them on top, where he could see them every time he opened the drawer. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something larger, a willingness to let the past inform the present rather than imprisoning it. For the first time in 10 years, Barrett fell asleep thinking not about what he had lost, but about what he had been fortunate enough to experience. The letters had reminded him that he was capable of great love, that he had once been a man who saw beauty and possibility in every day. Perhaps, he thought as sleep took him, he could be that man again. The family photograph sat on Miriam's dresser like a window into a world that had been destroyed in a single moment of crushing rock and timber. Barrett discovered it one morning when he knocked on the sisters' door to inform them that the piano tuner would arrive from Cheyenne that afternoon, a surprise he had arranged, after weeks of listening to Ruth coax melodies from the sisters' door. Aging instrument. Miriam opened the door wearing her dressing gown, her usually perfect hair loose around her shoulders, making her look younger and more vulnerable than Barrett had ever seen her. Behind her, Ruth sat at the small writing desk, penning what appeared to be a letter. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early," Barrett said, then stopped as his eyes fell on the photograph. It was a formal daguerreotype, the kind taken in professional studios with serious subjects posed against painted backdrops. 4 people stared back at the camera with the solemn dignity the medium required. 2 women who were unmistakably Miriam and Ruth in their younger years, and 2 men who bore the weathered look of miners despite their Sunday best. "That's Jacob and Samuel," Miriam said, following his gaze. "Taken for our 10th wedding anniversary, we all saved for months to afford studio portraits." Barrett studied the faces of the 2 men who had loved these remarkable women for 3 decades. Jacob stood behind Miriam with his hand on her shoulder, a stocky man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands that spoke of honest labor. Samuel, positioned behind Ruth, was taller and leaner, with the sort of smile that suggested he found joy, even in the difficult circumstances of mining camp life. "They look like good men," Barrett said, meaning it. "They were," Ruth said from the writing desk, turning to face him. "Jacob could make anyone laugh, even after the worst shifts, and Samuel saw beauty everywhere. He's the one who taught me that music could transform any space, no matter how rough or temporary." Barrett found himself moved by the obvious love in their voices when they spoke of their late husbands. There was no bitterness, no anger at the cruel twist of fate that had taken both men in the same accident. Only the kind of grief that came from genuine loss, tempered by gratitude for the years they had been given. "The piano tuner will be here this afternoon," he said, remembering why he had come. "I thought you should know, in case you wanted to be present when he works." Ruth's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. "You arranged for the piano to be tuned?" "It seemed practical," Barrett said, though they all knew it was more than that. "If you're going to give lessons, the instrument should be properly maintained." After he left them to finish their morning preparations, Barrett found himself thinking about the photograph and what it represented. Those 4 people had built a life together in circumstances that would have defeated lesser souls, the constant danger of mining work, the isolation of remote camps, the financial uncertainty that plagued working families throughout the territory. Yet the photograph radiated contentment, the satisfaction of people who had found love and purpose despite the challenges. It made Barrett realize how fortunate he had been during his own marriage. He and Margaret had faced challenges, certainly drought years, cattle diseases, the normal trials of building a ranch in hostile territory, but they had always had resources, options, the security that came from owning land and having money in the bank. The Tisdales and their husbands had built their happiness from much smaller foundations, making it in some ways more precious for its fragility. That afternoon, the piano tuner arrived as promised, a German immigrant named Klaus Zimmermann, who had learned his trade in Vienna before seeking his fortune in the American West. He was a meticulous man who approached the piano with the reverence due to a sacred object, running his hands over the keys and listening to each note with the intensity of a doctor diagnosing an illness. "This is a fine instrument," he told Barrett and Ruth as he began his work. "Steinway, made in New York around 1882. Someone cared for it well before it was neglected." "My wife played it daily," Barrett said. "After she died, it sat unused for 10 years. Zimmerman nodded with understanding. "Music dies when it is not heard, but it can be reborn with proper attention. This piano will sing again, I promise you." Ruth watched the tuning process with fascination, asking questions about temperament and string tension with the curiosity of someone eager to understand the craft behind the art. Barrett found himself equally engaged, learning for the first time about the complexity hidden within the instrument that had been part of his daily life for so many years. "Your wife chose well," Zimmerman told him as he worked. "This piano was built to last generations, to bring music to families for decades to come. It would be a shame to let it remain silent." "It won't be silent much longer," Barrett assured him. "Mrs. Tisdale is planning to give lessons to the local children." "Excellent." Zimmerman's face brightened. "Children are the future of music. Without them, the old songs die, and no new ones are born." As the tuner worked, Barrett and Ruth found themselves in conversation about music and memory, about the role art played in making life bearable during difficult times. Ruth told him about the singing that had filled the mining camps on Saturday nights, how families from a dozen different countries had shared their musical traditions, creating something new from the blending of old-world melodies with frontier experiences. "Music was our literature," she explained. "Most of the miners couldn't read, but they could remember songs that told stories, preserved history, passed down wisdom from generation to generation. A man might not know his letters, but he could sing ballads that taught his children about honor and courage and the price of hard choices." Barrett thought about this as he listened to Zimmerman test each key, making minute adjustments to bring the instrument back to perfect pitch. In his grief, he had silenced the music in his house, thinking he was preserving Margaret's memory. Instead, he had been starving something essential, cutting himself off from one of the great human consolations. "There," Zimmerman announced finally, running his hands across the keys in a cascade of perfectly tuned notes. "She is ready to sing again." Ruth approached the piano with something approaching reverence, settling onto the bench and placing her hands on the keys. The difference was immediately apparent where, before, the notes had been muddy and discordant. Now each key rang clear and true. She began with a simple melody, one of the folk songs from her collection, and the music seemed to fill not just the room but the entire house. Barrett closed his eyes and listened, feeling something shift inside his chest. This was not Margaret's playing. Ruth's touch was different, less formally trained but no less meaningful. Yet the music itself seemed to approve of the change, as if the piano had been waiting patiently for someone to awaken its voice. "Beautiful," Zimmerman said with professional satisfaction. "The piano knows it is loved again." That evening at dinner, the conversation turned to plans for Ruth's teaching venture. Barrett had spoken with several families in town, and there was genuine interest in piano lessons for their children. The parson's daughter, the banker's twin boys, the doctor's youngest girl all had been mentioned as potential students. "I'm nervous," Ruth admitted as she served dessert apple turnovers, made with fruit from the wild trees near Stone Creek. "It's been years since I taught formally, and never to children from proper families." "Children are children," Miriam said with the practical wisdom Barrett had come to value. "Rich or poor, they need patience, encouragement, and someone who believes in their ability to learn." "What will you charge for lessons?" Barrett asked. Ruth looked uncertain. "I hadn't thought about money. Perhaps 50 cents for an hour's instruction." "Make it $1, Barrett said firmly. "You're providing a valuable service, and you shouldn't undervalue your skills. Besides, people respect what they pay for." As they discussed the details of scheduling and payment, Barrett found himself thinking about the changes that had occurred in his house over the past month. The sisters had brought more than domestic efficiency. They had restored life to rooms that had stood empty, purpose to a man who had lost his way, and now music to an instrument that had grieved in silence for too long. "There's something else we should discuss," he said as Ruth poured coffee. "The situation with the Territorial Development Company." Both sisters looked at him attentively. They had heard about the riders and the questions about property rights, but Barrett had tried to shield them from his growing concerns about the threat to his land. "My lawyer in Cheyenne has been investigating," Barrett continued. "It appears that someone is challenging the validity of my original water rights claims, suggesting that the surveys were improperly conducted or that I failed to meet certain territorial requirements." "Is there validity to these claims?" Miriam asked. "None whatsoever. My paperwork is in perfect order, filed properly and on time. But legal challenges can be expensive and time-consuming, even when they're baseless." Ruth set down her coffee cup with a thoughtful expression. "The mining camp lawyers always said that possession is 9/10 of the law, but the other 10th can be very expensive." "Exactly." Barrett appreciated her quick understanding. "Someone is hoping to force me into a settlement rather than fighting a prolonged legal battle." "But why?" Miriam asked. "What do they gain from your land?" Barrett stood and walked to the window, looking out at the valley that had been his sanctuary for so many years. "Water rights primarily. The springs that feed Stone Creek are some of the most reliable in the territory. With more ranchers moving in and talk of railroad development, water is becoming more valuable than gold." He turned back to face them, these two women who had become so important to his life that the thought of losing them was almost unbearable. "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'll do everything in my power to protect this place and your position here." Ruth and Miriam exchanged one of their silent communications, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in a glance. Finally, Miriam spoke. "Mr. Hale, there's something we haven't told you about the mining accident, something that might be relevant to your current troubles." Barrett felt a chill of premonition. "What kind of something?" "The mine collapse wasn't entirely accidental," Ruth said quietly. "There had been warnings about unstable timbers in that section, complaints from the miners about safety conditions. But the mine owners pushed for increased production anyway, despite the risks. Jacob and Samuel were among the men who filed formal complaints," Miriam continued. "They were told to keep quiet or find other work. When they refused to back down, they were assigned to the most dangerous shifts, the deepest tunnels where cave-ins were most likely." Barrett stared at them, understanding dawning slowly. "You think they were deliberately put in harm's way?" "We think they were silenced," Miriam said bluntly, "along with 15 other men who knew too much about corner cutting and safety violations. The mine was sold to new owners 3 weeks after the collapse, before any investigation could be completed." "And you think this connects to my current troubles? How?" Ruth answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because the company that bought the mine was called Territorial Development Corporation, the same name as the group questioning your water rights." The revelation hit Barrett like a physical blow. These women hadn't come to him by chance. They were connected to his enemies in ways none of them had understood. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, heavy with the knowledge that protecting his land might mean protecting them from people who had already proven willing to kill to get what they wanted. The forged legal documents arrived on a Tuesday morning with the same innocent appearance as any other mail delivery, but their contents would shatter Barrett's understanding of both his past and present. Tom Morrison, his lawyer in Cheyenne, had sent them via express courier with a note that read simply, "Barrett, examine these immediately. We need to talk. Tom." Barrett spread the papers across his study desk, while Miriam and Ruth went about their morning tasks, unaware that their carefully rebuilt world was about to face its greatest test. The documents purported to be previously undiscovered debts incurred by Margaret during her charitable work promissory notes for supplies purchased for needy families, loans taken against the ranch to fund her various benevolent projects. According to the papers, Margaret had signed her name to obligations totaling nearly $30,000, all guaranteed by the Stone Creek Lodge and its water rights. The supposed creditors were listed as various mining and development companies, including the Territorial Development Corporation. Most damning of all, the documents claimed that Barrett's marriage to Margaret had made him legally responsible for these debts upon her death. Debts that had now come due with a decade's worth of accumulated interest. Barrett's hands shook as he read through the fabricated paperwork. The forgeries were sophisticated, the signatures looked remarkably like Margaret's careful script. The legal language was properly formatted, and the dates corresponded to periods when Margaret had indeed been active in charitable work. Someone had invested considerable time and resources in creating a believable fiction. "Mr. Hale?" Ruth's voice came from the doorway, her tone concerned. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." Barrett looked up from the papers, his face drawn with the weight of understanding. "In a way, I have. Someone has forged documents claiming Margaret owed substantial debts at the time of her death. They're using these papers to challenge my ownership of the ranch." Ruth entered the study, followed closely by Miriam, who had clearly sensed trouble from her sister's tone. Both women examined the documents with the careful attention of people who had learned to spot deception through hard experience. "These signatures look authentic," Miriam observed, holding one of the promissory notes up to the light from the window. "But Margaret would never have signed such papers without telling you." "Of course she wouldn't," Barrett said with absolute certainty. "Margaret discussed every expenditure over $5 with me. She was scrupulously honest about money, sometimes to a fault. There's no way she would have incurred debts of this magnitude without my knowledge." Ruth studied the list of supposed creditors, her face growing pale as she recognized several names. "These companies, we know some of them. They were involved in mining operations throughout the Sweetwater district. Jacob and Samuel dealt with their representatives over the years." "What kind of dealings?" Barrett asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The sort that made honest miners nervous," Miriam replied grimly. "Companies that cut corners on safety, bribed territorial officials, and seemed to have unlimited resources for buying up land and water rights when smaller operations failed." Barrett felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "They've been planning this for years. The mining accident, your husband's deaths, your arrival here, none of it was coincidental." "What do you mean?" Ruth asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand. "Think about it," Barrett said, rising from his desk to pace the length of the study. "Your husbands were killed because they knew too much about safety violations and corporate corruption. You were left destitute and desperate for employment. My advertisement for a housekeeper appeared just when you needed it most." Miriam's face showed dawning horror. "You think they orchestrated our meeting?" "I think they've been watching this ranch for years, waiting for the right opportunity to challenge my ownership. When they couldn't find legitimate grounds, they decided to create them. But they needed inside information about Margaret's activities, her signature, her charitable work." Barrett stopped pacing and looked directly at both sisters. "Where did you see my advertisement for a housekeeper?" Ruth and Miriam exchanged glances. "It was posted on the message board at the Sweetwater Company store," Ruth said slowly. "A man there said it might be perfect for our situation, that you were a good employer who paid fair wages." "What man?" "Someone who said he knew you by reputation," Miriam answered. "A well-dressed fellow with a beard and expensive boots. He seemed to know quite a bit about your household situation." Barrett returned to his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper, writing quickly. "I need you both to think carefully about this man. What did he look like? What exactly did he say? Any detail you can remember might be important." As the sisters tried to recall their conversation with the mysterious stranger, Barrett's mind raced through the implications. Someone had orchestrated their arrival at his ranch, probably hoping they would gather information about his finances, his legal vulnerabilities, perhaps even his personal habits. Instead, they had become something unexpected, genuine companions who had transformed his house into a home. "There's more," Miriam said reluctantly. "After we decided to answer your advertisement, the same man appeared again. He asked us to keep him informed about your business dealings, claimed he represented potential investors who might be interested in partnership opportunities." "Did you agree?" "Of course not," Ruth said indignantly. "We may have been desperate, but we weren't dishonest. We told him we weren't in the business of spying on our employers." Barrett felt a surge of relief followed immediately by renewed worry. If the sisters had refused to cooperate, they might have become liabilities rather than assets to whoever was orchestrating this scheme. "You could be in danger," he told them bluntly. "If they were counting on your cooperation and you refused to provide it, they might see you as obstacles to be removed." The weight of this possibility settled over the room like smoke from a poorly tended fire. These women had already lost their husbands to corporate greed and corruption. The thought that they might face similar threats because of their association with him filled Barrett with a protective rage that surprised him with its intensity. "We won't be driven away," Miriam said with quiet determination. "Not again. We've lost one home to these people. We won't lose another without a fight." Ruth nodded agreement, her gentle demeanor hardening into something more formidable. "Besides, we know things about their operations that they probably don't realize. 30 years in the mining camps teaches you to notice things, to remember conversations that might seem unimportant at the time." Barrett looked at these two remarkable women who had faced tragedy and displacement with such dignity, who had rebuilt their lives from nothing and were now prepared to defend their new home against the same forces that had destroyed their old one. "What kind of things?" he asked. "Names, dates, financial arrangements that didn't seem quite legitimate," Miriam said. "Jacob kept detailed records of safety violations and company responses. Samuel documented suspicious accidents and the families who lost breadwinners in incidents that could have been prevented. Where are these records now?" Ruth smiled for the first time since they had begun examining the forged documents. "Hidden in the most secure place we could think of, sewn into the lining of my music collection case. We thought if we ever had the chance to seek justice for our husbands, we might need evidence." Barrett stared at them with growing amazement. "You've been carrying evidence of corporate murder and corruption with you all this time?" "We didn't know what else to do with it," Miriam admitted. "The territorial authorities seemed more interested in protecting mining interests than investigating worker deaths. But we couldn't bring ourselves to destroy the only record of what really happened. Those records might be exactly what we need to fight back." Barrett realized. If we can prove that the Territorial Development Corporation was involved in covering up the mining accident, it would cast serious doubt on the legitimacy of these debt claims. He moved to the window, looking out at the land that had been his refuge and was now under direct assault. But for the first time since receiving the forged documents, he felt something other than despair. He felt the stirring of strategy, the cold calculation that had served him well in business dealings over the years. "They made one crucial mistake," he said, turning back to face the sisters. "They assumed you would be passive victims, grateful for employment, and willing to betray my trust for their benefit. Instead, they've given me allies who know their secrets and have evidence of their crimes." "What do we do now?" Ruth asked. Barrett walked to his safe and began extracting documents, property deeds, business contracts, financial records accumulated over 15 years of successful ranching. "Now we fight back. We expose their crimes, challenge their forged documents, and make them regret the day they decided to target this ranch." "And if they respond with violence?" Miriam asked pragmatically. "These aren't people who hesitate to eliminate obstacles." Barrett opened a locked drawer and withdrew something that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. A Colt .45 revolver that had seen service during his younger years. "Then they'll discover that some obstacles are harder to eliminate than others." As afternoon faded into evening, the three of them worked together to catalogue the evidence they had accumulated against their common enemies. Ruth's hidden records provided names and dates, Barrett's business connections offered leverage, and Miriam's practical wisdom helped them plan their strategy. For the first time since Margaret's death, Barrett felt like he was fighting for something larger than mere survival. He was fighting for a home that had been transformed by unexpected love, for two women who had proven that courage could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and for the future they were building together against all odds. The battle for Stone Creek Lodge was about to begin in earnest. Barrett's military service medal lay hidden beneath layers of old clothes in a trunk that hadn't been opened in 15 years, but the skills it represented had never truly left him. As he polished the tarnished brass and read the inscription, "For valor in service to the 4th Cavalry Regiment, Indian Wars, 1875, 1879, memories flooded back of a younger man who had learned to think strategically under pressure, to protect those who depended on him, and to face overwhelming odds with calculated courage. "I didn't know you served in the cavalry," Ruth said from the doorway of his bedroom, where she had come to inform him that Sheriff Donovan was downstairs, asking urgent questions. Barrett held up the medal, its ribbon faded but its metal still solid. 4 years on the frontier, chasing Sioux and Cheyenne war parties across Montana and Wyoming. I learned that the best defense is often a well-planned offense, and that enemies who underestimate you have already given you an advantage. Is that what we're going to do? Go on the offense? That's exactly what we're going to do, Barrett confirmed, pinning the medal to his vest. But first, let's see what the sheriff has to tell us. Downstairs, they found Sheriff Donovan pacing the great room with the nervous energy of a man bearing bad news. Joe Garrett sat nearby, his weathered face grim, while Miriam poured coffee with the steady hands of someone determined to maintain civility even in crisis. "Barrett," Donovan said without preamble, "I've got news from Cheyenne that changes everything. The territorial governor has received formal complaints about your household arrangements and your land claims. Someone with significant political influence is pushing for an investigation." "What kind of investigation?" Barrett asked, settling into his chair with the outward calm his military training had taught him. "The kind that could result in territorial seizure of disputed properties pending resolution of legal challenges," Donovan replied. "They're claiming you've been operating outside territorial law in multiple areas, improper cohabitation, failure to maintain valid water rights, possibly even harboring fugitives." Ruth gasped. "Fugitives?" "Someone has suggested that you ladies might be wanted in connection with the mining camp incident," Donovan explained reluctantly, "claiming you had advanced knowledge of the accident and fled to avoid questioning." The accusation was so outrageous that Barrett felt his temper flare, but years of strategic thinking kept his voice level. "Who's making these claims?" "A lawyer named Edmund Carson, representing something called the Territorial Development Corporation. He's got documents, witnesses, and enough political connections to make his accusations stick long enough to cause serious damage." Barrett exchanged glances with Miriam and Ruth. Carson was the same man who had sent riders to survey his land, the well-dressed stranger who had approached the sisters at the company store. The web of conspiracy was tightening around them with the precision of a military campaign. "When is this investigation supposed to begin?" Barrett asked. "Carson is demanding an immediate territorial hearing," Donovan said. "He's claiming that every day the situation continues represents a threat to public morality and territorial law. The governor has agreed to convene a special session next week." Joe Garrett spoke up from his chair near the fireplace. "Boss, there's more. Word came in from the line camps this morning. Armed riders have been spotted all along our northern boundaries. They're not making threats yet, but they're making their presence known." Barrett absorbed this information with the calm that came from understanding that the battle was finally beginning in earnest. His enemies had played their opening moves, legal challenges, political pressure, and implied physical threats. Now it was his turn to respond. "Joe, I want you to send word to every rancher in the valley," Barrett said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Tell them what's happening here. If Carson's group can fabricate charges against us, they can do the same to anyone. We need to stand together." "Already started," Joe replied with grim satisfaction. "Bill Henderson and Tom Crawford said they'll ride with us if it comes to that. They remember what happened to the Millers when that land company moved in last year." Barrett nodded. The Miller Ranch had been seized under questionable circumstances, the family driven off their land by legal maneuvers they couldn't afford to fight. It had been a warning that none of the local ranchers had forgotten. "Sheriff," Barrett continued, "I need to know where you stand in this. Are you going to enforce whatever trumped-up warrants Carson produces?" Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "Barrett, you know I've got to follow territorial law, but I also know the difference between justice and illegal lynching. If Carson's charges are as baseless as they seem, I'll fight them within the system. And if the system is rigged against us..." The sheriff met his eyes directly. "Then you do what you have to do to protect what's yours, and I'll be busy investigating other crimes when it happens." It was as much support as Barrett could hope for from a man in Donovan's position. The sheriff couldn't openly defy territorial authority, but he wouldn't actively assist in what amounted to legalized theft. After Donovan left, Barrett gathered his small band of allies in the study to plan their strategy. Ruth had retrieved her hidden records from the music case, spreading dozens of papers across his desk. Jacob and Samuel's meticulous documentation of safety violations, suspicious accidents, and corporate cover-ups that painted a damning picture of systemic corruption. "This is incredible," Barrett said, reading through Samuel's notes about the mine collapse. He documented everything: the warnings that were ignored, the safety equipment that was never provided, even the names of company officials who ordered increased production despite known dangers. "Samuel was careful that way," Ruth said with quiet pride. "He said someone needed to keep an honest record, even if nobody wanted to hear the truth." Miriam pointed to another document. "And this letter from Jacob to the territorial mining inspector, he warned that men would die if conditions weren't improved." The inspector's response was to recommend Jacob for transfer to a different operation. Barrett studied the evidence with growing excitement. This isn't just proof of negligence, it's evidence of deliberate murder. If we can connect these same companies to the current threats against our ranch, we can expose the whole conspiracy. "How do we do that?" Ruth asked. "By making them come to us," Barrett replied, his strategic mind working through the possibilities. "They want this ranch badly enough to fabricate evidence and risk territorial exposure. We give them the chance to take it under circumstances that expose their real intentions." He moved to the large map of his property that hung on the study wall, pointing to the northern section where the most valuable water rights were located. "They think they're dealing with a grieving widower and two helpless women. They don't know about my military background or your evidence of their crimes. We use that ignorance against them." Over the next 3 days, Barrett put his plan into motion with the precision of a cavalry officer preparing for battle. He sent word to Tom Morrison in Cheyenne, instructing his lawyer to demand a full investigation of the Territorial Development Corporation's business practices. He contacted the Territorial Mining Inspector, providing copies of Jacob and Samuel's safety reports, along with pointed questions about why their warnings had been ignored. Most importantly, he began spreading carefully crafted rumors throughout Bear Creek and the surrounding ranchestries about his declining health, his growing despair over the legal challenges, his supposed consideration of selling the ranch rather than fighting a prolonged battle. "You want them to think we're ready to give up?" Miriam asked as she helped prepare for what might be their final stand. "I want them to think victory is so close they'll take risks they might otherwise avoid," Barrett explained. "Desperate people make mistakes, and we need them to make a big one." Ruth had thrown herself into preparations with surprising determination. She had moved her most precious possessions, including the photograph of the 4 of them, and her sheet music collection to the hidden cellar beneath the kitchen, a root cellar that could serve as a refuge if the ranch came under direct assault. "I won't run again," she declared, as she helped Barrett clean and load firearms that hadn't been used in years. "These people took our husbands, our home, our entire way of life. If they want this place, they'll have to fight for it." Barrett watched her handle the rifle with competence that suggested she wasn't entirely inexperienced with weapons. "You've shot before?" "Mining camps weren't peaceful places," she replied, matter-of-factly. "A woman learned to protect herself, or she didn't survive long. Miriam and I both know our way around firearms." The revelation shouldn't have surprised him, but it added another layer to his growing understanding of these remarkable women. They had survived 30 years, in dangerous conditions, raised children who weren't their own, buried husbands they loved, and rebuilt their lives from nothing. They were not victims waiting for rescue. They were warriors who had been underestimated for the last time. On Thursday evening, the message Barrett had been expecting finally arrived. A formal letter from Edmund Carson, delivered by a nervous young clerk who clearly wanted to complete his errand and leave as quickly as possible. Mr. Hale. The letter read, "The Territorial Development Corporation is prepared to offer a generous settlement for your property, including assumption of all outstanding debts and legal obligations. This offer expires at midnight Friday. Failure to accept will result in immediate territorial action to seize disputed assets. The choice is yours: voluntary sale or forced seizure. Choose wisely." Barrett read the ultimatum aloud to his gathered allies, Miriam, Ruth, Joe Garrett, and 3 neighboring ranchers who had ridden over to offer support. The letter was exactly what he had hoped, forwardance of extortion that no honest court could ignore. "They're not even pretending to be legitimate anymore," Joe observed. "This is pure intimidation." "Which is exactly what we needed," Barrett replied. "Tomorrow night, they'll come here expecting to find a defeated old man ready to sign over his property. Instead, they'll find something they didn't expect." He walked to the window, looking out at the land that had been his refuge and was now his battleground. "I've sent copies of their letter to Sheriff Donovan, to the territorial governor, and to 3 newspaper editors in Cheyenne and Denver. If they want to play this game publicly, they'll discover that publicity cuts both ways." Ruth joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Are you ready for this?" Barrett thought about the question seriously. Tomorrow would likely bring violence to the place that had known only peace since Margaret's death. Men might die defending or attacking this ranch, and the outcome was far from certain. Yet for the first time in 10 years, he felt truly alive, fighting for something that mattered more than mere survival. "I'm ready," he said quietly. "The question is whether they're ready for us." As his allies dispersed to their final preparations, Barrett remained at the window with the 2 women who had transformed his fortress of solitude into a home worth defending. Tomorrow would test everything they had built together, but tonight they stood united, 3 unlikely companions who had found in each other the courage to face whatever came next. The battle for Stone Creek Lodge would begin at dawn. The lodge's foundation stone bore Margaret's initials carved into granite with the same care Barrett had once devoted to building their life together. But this morning it served as more than a memorial. It had become a symbol of everything he was prepared to defend. As dawn broke over the valley, Barrett knelt beside the cornerstone he had laid 15 years ago, running his fingers over the weathered letters M.H. while his mind focused on the battle ahead. "She would have stood with us," Ruth said quietly, appearing beside him in the early morning light. "Margaret, I mean. She wouldn't have run from bullies." Barrett looked up at this woman who had helped him remember that his wife's memory could inspire courage rather than paralysis. No, she wouldn't have. Margaret never backed down from what she believed was right, even when it would have been easier. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment of reflection. Joe Garrett rode up from the bunkhouse with 3 of the ranch hands, all armed and grim-faced. Behind them came the neighboring ranchers. Barrett had summoned Bill Henderson with his 2 eldest sons, Tom Crawford and his foreman, and surprisingly, old Henrik Larson, who hadn't picked up a rifle in 20 years but had come anyway. "Any word from town?" Barrett asked Joe. "Sheriff's got men watching the roads, but he's keeping them back like you asked. Carson's group rode in yesterday evening, 8 men, all armed, staying at the hotel and making no secret of their intentions." Barrett nodded. The plan was working so far. Carson believed he was dealing with a broken man ready to surrender, not realizing that every move was being carefully observed and documented. "Positions, gentlemen," Barrett said, rising from beside the foundation stone. "Remember, we're not starting this fight, but we're going to finish it." The men dispersed to their assigned positions, some in the house's upper windows, others in the barn and outbuildings, all with clear fields of fire and instructions to wait for Barrett's signal before engaging. This was not a desperate last stand, but a carefully planned defense designed to expose their enemy's true nature. Inside the house, Miriam and Ruth had transformed the great room into something between a fortress and a parlor. Furniture had been repositioned to provide cover while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Rifles lay within easy reach, but hidden from casual view. Most importantly, Ruth had set up her camera borrowed from the town photographerin, a position where it could document whatever was about to unfold. "Are you certain about this?" Barrett asked them one final time. "You could be in the cellar, safe from whatever happens." "We've run from these people once," Miriam said firmly, checking the load in her rifle with practiced efficiency. "We won't do it again. This is our home too now, and we'll defend it." Ruth nodded agreement, her gentle demeanor replaced by the steel Barrett had glimpsed in their earlier conversations. "Besides, someone needs to operate the camera. The world should see what kind of men we're dealing with." The waiting began as the sun climbed higher, tension building like the pressure before a storm. Barrett positioned himself at the great room's main window, where he could see the approach from town while remaining partially concealed. His military training had taught him that the moments before battle were often the hardest when doubt could creep in, when the magnitude of what you were risking became clear. At precisely 10 o'clock, the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, moving with the deliberate pace of men confident in their power. 8 riders, just as Joe had reported, led by a figure Barrett recognized from descriptions as Edmund Carsonwell dressed, mounted on an expensive horse, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who had never faced serious opposition. "Here they come," Barrett called softly, and the house seemed to hold its breath as everyone took their positions. The riders approached the lodge without haste, spreading out in a loose formation that spoke of military experience. These weren't simple hired guns, they were professionals who knew their business. But they were also confident to the point of carelessness, expecting to face an elderly rancher and 2 women rather than a coordinated defense. Carson rode to within 20 feet of the front porch before dismounting, his men remaining horsed but ready. He walked to the door with the swagger of a man who had never been refused anything he wanted. "Hail," he called out. "Time's up. Come out and we'll discuss terms like civilized men." Barrett opened the door but remained in the doorway, his hands visible but close to the revolver at his hip. "Terms were in your letter, Carson. You want my land, and you're threatening to take it if I don't sell." "Smart man," Carson said with an oily smile, "though I prefer to think of it as offering you a way to salvage something from a hopeless situation. The territorial governor has already signed the seizure order. You can sell to us voluntarily and walk away with some compensation, or you can fight and lose everything." Barrett stepped onto the porch, noting how Carson's men shifted nervously in their saddles. They had expected surrender, not defiance. "I'd like to see that seizure order." Carson's smile faltered slightly. "The paperwork is being processed in Cheyenne, but I have authority to act on the territory's behalf." "Whose authority?" "Mine," Carson said, his voice hardening, "and that's all the authority I need." It was exactly the admission Barrett had hoped for. Carson had just confessed to acting without proper legal backing, threatening a territorial citizen with force based solely on his own claims. Ruth's camera had captured every word. "I'm afraid I'll need more than your word," Barrett said calmly. "If you want my land, you'll have to provide legitimate documentation or—" "Or what?" Carson interrupted, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "You'll fight 8 armed men with what your housekeeper and her sister." Barrett smiled, the cold expression of a man who had faced worse odds and survived. Something like that. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 8 mounted men facing 1 man on a porch, while unseen defenders waited for the signal to act. Carson's confidence was beginning to crack as he realized this wasn't going according to plan. "You're making a mistake, Hale," Carson said, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "We have more men, better weapons, and the law on our side." "Do you?" Barrett asked mildly. "Because from where I stand, It looks like you have 8 hired guns trying to steal an honest man's property through intimidation and forged documents." Carson's face flushed red. "Those documents are legitimate." "Then you won't mind if Sheriff Donovan examines them," Barrett said, gesturing toward the road where a column of dust announced the approach of more riders. Carson spun around to see Sheriff Donovan leading 6 deputies toward the lodge, all armed and looking grimly determined. But instead of panic, Carson's face showed cunning calculation. "Sheriff," he called out as Donovan's group approached. "Perfect timing. I'm here to serve territorial warrants on Barrett Hale and his accomplices." Donovan dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Is that so? I'll need to see those warrants." Carson reached into his coat with exaggerated confidence, producing a sheaf of papers that looked official enough to fool a casual observer. Warrants for the arrest of Barrett Hale on charges of harboring fugitives and operating in violation of territorial morality statutes. Also, warrants for Miriam and Ruth Tisdale on charges of conspiracy and fleeing the scene of criminal activity. Barrett watched Donovan examine the papers, noting the sheriff's careful attention to details. These warrants might be more legitimate than the forged debt documents, given Carson's apparent political connections. "These appear to be in order," Donovan said reluctantly. "Barrett, I'm sorry, but I'll have to take you and the ladies into custody pending a territorial hearing." It was the moment Barrett had prepared for, the point where legal maneuvering would give way to more direct action. Carson had played his strongest card, producing warrants that might or might not be legitimate, but carried enough official weight to complicate any resistance. "Sheriff," Barrett said carefully, "I need you to understand something. These men aren't here to serve warrants. They're here to steal my land through intimidation and violence. The warrants are just legal cover for armed robbery." "That's a serious accusation," Donovan replied. "Can you prove it?" Barrett looked toward the window where Ruth stood with her camera, then back at Carson's increasingly nervous men. "As a matter of fact, I can." The battle was about to begin in earnest, but it would be fought with evidence and truth rather than bullets, at least initially. Carson had made his move, playing his legal cards with confidence born of corruption and political influence. Now it was Barrett's turn to reveal the strength of his own position. The real confrontation was just beginning. Ruth's wedding band caught the morning sunlight as she slipped it from her finger. The simple gold circle that had symbolized 30 years of marriage to Samuel now offered as evidence of her commitment to the new family she had found. Standing in the doorway beside Miriam, she held the ring up for all to see. Carson's men, Sheriff Donovan's deputies, and the hidden defenders who waited for Barrett's signal. "Sheriff Donovan," Ruth called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Before you serve those warrants, there's something you need to know about the men who provided them." Carson's face darkened with anger. "The territorial warrants speak for themselves. These women are fugitives from... These women are widows whose husbands were murdered." Barrett interrupted, his voice cutting through Carson's bluster like a blade. "Murdered by the same companies that are now trying to steal my ranch through forged documents and fabricated charges." Ruth stepped forward, her wedding ring glinting in her palm. "This ring belonged to Samuel Tisdale, my husband of 30 years. He died in the Sweetwater mine collapse 6 weeks ago, accident that killed 17 men who had filed formal complaints about safety violations." She opened her other hand to reveal a folded document. "This is Samuel's last letter to the territorial mining inspector, warning that men would die if conditions weren't improved. The inspector's response was to recommend Samuel for transfer to a remote operation where accidents were more easily covered up." Donovan looked from Ruth to Carson, his weathered face showing the careful attention of a man trying to navigate between competing claims. "Ma'am, that's a serious allegation. Do you have proof?" "We have 30 years' worth of proof," Miriam said, emerging from the house with a leather satchel that Barrett recognized as the one that had held Ruth's sheet music. "Safety reports, witness statements, correspondence with territorial officials, all documenting a pattern of deliberate negligence that amounts to murder." Carson's men shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was taking. This was supposed to be a simple seizure of disputed property, not an exposition of corporate crimes that reached into the territorial government itself. "Sheriff," Carson said urgently, "these people are trying to distract from their own criminal activity. The warrants are legitimate, signed by proper territorial authority." "Whose authority?" Barrett asked pointedly. "Who signed those warrants, Carson?" Carson hesitated for just a moment long enough to reveal that he wasn't entirely confident in his answer. "Territorial Judge Hamilton Morrison, acting under emergency powers granted by the governor." Barrett felt a cold smile spread across his face. "Hamilton Morrison? Tom Morrison's brother?" "What's your point?" Carson demanded. "My point is that Tom Morrison is my lawyer, and his brother would never sign warrants against me without at least courtesy of notification." Barrett gestured toward the approaching dust cloud that had appeared on the southern horizon. "In fact, I believe that's Tom riding this way now, probably wondering why his brother's signature is on documents he never saw." The approaching riders resolved into Tom Morrison, leading a small group that included a man Barrett didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested official authority. Carson's confidence was beginning to crack as he realized his carefully planned legal ambush was falling apart. "Sheriff," the stranger called out as the new group arrived, "I'm Deputy Territorial Marshal James Crawford. I'm here to investigate reports of fraudulent legal documents and unauthorized use of territorial authority." Carson's face went white. "Marshal, there's been some misunderstanding." "Has there?" Crawford dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. "Because I have reports that someone has been forging territorial warrants and using them to intimidate honest citizens." Ruth stepped forward again, her wedding ring still gleaming in her palm. "Marshal Crawford, I offer this ring as bond for my truthfulness. Everything I'm about to tell you can be verified through territorial records." She began to speak, her voice clear and steady as she laid out the conspiracy that had destroyed her first life and now threatened her second. She told of safety warnings ignored, of mine officials who cared more about production quotas than worker safety, of mysterious accidents that eliminated troublesome employees. Most damning of all, she produced Samuel's meticulous records, documenting connections between the Territorial Development Corporation and a web of corruption that reached deep into the territorial government. Carson tried to interrupt several times, but Marshal Crawford silenced him with a look that promised serious consequences for any interference. As Ruth's testimony continued, supported by documents that Miriam produced with the efficiency of a court clerk, the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. "These are photocopies of original documents," Miriam explained to the marshal. "The originals are in a safe deposit box in Denver, along with witness statements from 17 families who lost breadwinners to accidents that could have been prevented." "Where did you get photocopies made?" Crawford asked with professional interest. "The photography studio in Cheyenne," Ruth replied. "The same one where we had this morning's events documented." She gestured toward the camera that had been recording the confrontation from the house's front window. Barrett watched Carson's face as the man realized he had been outmaneuvered at every turn. The carefully planned legal ambush had become a public exposition of crimes that would be impossible to cover up. Carson's political connections might protect him from some consequences, but not from having his methods exposed to territorial and federal scrutiny. "Marshal," Carson said desperately, "whatever these people claim about past events, the immediate issue is the seizure warrants for this property. Those are legitimate territorial documents." Crawford examined the warrants with the careful attention of someone who knew how to spot forgeries. "These signatures are interesting," he said finally. "Judge Morrison's signature, Governor Richard's seal, all very official looking." "Because they're genuine," Carson insisted. "Perhaps," Crawford agreed, "but they're also dated yesterday, claiming emergency circumstances that require immediate action. Yet I spoke with Governor Richards 2 days ago, and he made no mention of any emergency involving this property." Barrett felt the momentum shifting decisively in their favor. Carson had overplayed his hand, using forged or improperly obtained warrants in an attempt to seize property through intimidation. The legal cover he had counted on was dissolving under scrutiny. "Sheriff Donovan," Crawford continued, "I'm placing Edmund Carson and his associates under territorial custody pending investigation of these allegations. The warrants they've presented appear to be fraudulent." Carson's men looked to their leader for guidance, hands drifting toward weapons as they realized their carefully planned operation was collapsing. This was the moment Barrett had prepared, for when legal maneuvering would give way to violence as desperate men made desperate choices. "Nobody needs to get hurt here," Barrett called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "You men are hired guns, not conspirators. Drop your weapons and ride away, and there's no reason for anyone to pursue you." For a moment, the outcome hung in balance as 8 armed men considered their options. Then Carson made the choice that sealed his fate. "Kill them all," he snarled, drawing his pistol with the desperation of a man who knew he was trapped. "If we can't take the ranch legally, we'll take it by force and claim self-defense later." The morning erupted into violence as Carson's men went for their guns. But they were facing not helpless victims, but a coordinated defense that had been planned with military precision. Barrett's hidden allies opened fire from concealed positions, catching the attackers in a crossfire that left them with nowhere to run. Barrett himself drew and fired in one smooth motion, his bullet taking Carson's center mass and dropping him before the man could complete his draw. Around the yard, the battle raged for perhaps 30 seconds before the surviving attackers threw down their weapons and surrendered. When the gun smoke cleared, Carson lay dead beside the foundation stone that bore Margaret's initials, his schemes ended by the same violence he had tried to employ. 3 of his men were wounded, 2 more dead, and the rest faced territorial custody on charges ranging from conspiracy to attempted murder. "It's over," Barrett said quietly, holstering his weapon as he looked around at the scene of his final battle. The lodge still stood, the land was still his, and the 2 women who had given his life meaning again were safe. Ruth approached him, her wedding ring now back on her finger where it belonged. "Samuel would have been proud," she said simply. "You defended our home the way he would have wanted to defend his family." Miriam nodded agreement, her practical nature already turning toward the work of cleaning up after the battle. "Now we can truly begin our new life, without threats hanging over us." Barrett looked at these 2 remarkable women who had transformed his fortress of grief into a home worth fighting for, then at the land that had been his refuge and was now his legacy. The battle for Stone Creek Lodge was over, but the life they would build together was just beginning. The new family portrait sat prominently on the mantelpiece above the great room's fireplace, a formal photograph taken 6 months after the battle that had secured their home and their future. In it, Barrett stood between Miriam and Ruth, all 3 dressed in their finest clothes, their faces bearing the contentment of people who had found where they belonged. Unlike the daguerreotype of the Tisdale sisters with their first husbands, this image radiated not just love, but the quiet satisfaction of battles won and peace earned. Barrett paused in his morning routine to study the photograph, still amazed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. The spring of 1897 had arrived with the promise of new beginnings, and the stone lodge that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of life fully lived. "Mr. Hale Barrett," Ruth called from the music room, where she was preparing for the afternoon's piano lessons. "Mrs. Henderson is bringing her youngest daughter today, the one with such natural talent for melody." Barrett smiled at the correction. It had taken months for the sisters to feel comfortable using his first name, and longer still for him to understand that their formality had been protection rather than distance. Now they moved through the house with the easy familiarity of people who had claimed to every room, every corner, every moment of domestic happiness. In the kitchen, Miriam was preparing lunch for the children who would arrive later for Ruth's piano lessons. The teaching venture had grown beyond anyone's expectations, drawing students from as far away as Cheyenne, whose parents were willing to make the journey for quality instruction. More importantly, it had established the sisters as respected members of the community, their past troubles overshadowed by their present contributions. The Thompson boy is making real progress with his scales, Miriam reported as Barrett entered the kitchen. And little Sarah Morrison asked if she could bring her grandmother next week. Apparently the old lady used to play piano back in Ohio. Barrett poured his coffee from the pot that was always ready, marveling at how thoroughly these two women had transformed not just his house, but the entire valley's understanding of what constituted proper domestic arrangements. The gossip that had once threatened their position had given way to genuine respect as the community witnessed the obvious happiness and stability of their unusual household. "Any word from Denver about the territorial investigation?" Miriam asked, though her tone suggested she was no longer deeply worried about the answer. "Tom Morrison says the grand jury will hand down indictments next week," Barrett replied. "Carson's associates are cooperating with federal investigators, and it looks like the corruption reaches even higher than we suspected. The territorial governor himself may face charges." The investigation that had grown out of their confrontation with Carson had exposed a web of corruption involving mining companies, territorial officials, and federal land agents. Barrett's ranch had been just one target in a larger scheme to consolidate water rights and valuable property under the control of a few powerful interests. The evidence that Ruth and Miriam had preserved from the mining camp had proved crucial in unraveling the conspiracy. "Justice is a slow creature," Miriam observed, "but it seems to arrive eventually." Barrett nodded, thinking about the changes that justice had brought to their lives. The Territorial Development Corporation had been dissolved, its assets seized to compensate the families of miners killed in preventable accidents. Carson's surviving associates faced long prison sentences, and several territorial officials had resigned in disgrace. Most importantly, the legal cloud over Barrett's property had been permanently lifted, his title to the land confirmed beyond any future challenge. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts, not the threatening drum of armed riders, but the cheerful clatter of families arriving for the afternoon's activities. Ruth's piano lessons had evolved into social gatherings that brought the scattered ranch families together, creating a sense of community that the isolated valley had never known before. "Barrett," Ruth called from the front porch, "the Hendersons are here, and they've brought news from town." Barrett joined her on the porch, where Bill Henderson was helping his wife and daughters down from their wagon. The rancher's face bore the satisfaction of a man delivering welcome news. "Barrett, Ruth," Henderson called out, "thought you'd want to hear the territorial legislature passed the new Mining Safety Act yesterday. Every company operating in Wyoming Territory will have to meet federal safety standards or face immediate shutdown." It was a victory that Jacob and Samuel Tisdale would never see, but their widows would. The evidence they had preserved at such personal cost had not only protected their new home, but had also ensured that other families wouldn't face the same dangers that had claimed their first husbands. "Samuel would have been so pleased," Ruth said quietly, her eyes bright with tears of satisfaction rather than sorrow. "He always said someone needed to speak for the men who couldn't speak for themselves." As the afternoon progressed, the house filled with the sounds Barrett had once thought lost forever: children's laughter, women's conversation, the gentle melodies of piano music drifting from room to room. Ruth worked with her students at the newly tuned piano, while Miriam supervised the younger children who had come with their siblings, turning what could have been chaos into organized joy. Barrett found himself in the role of storyteller, entertaining the boys with tales of cavalry service and frontier adventures while their sisters learned to play. It was a position he had never expected to occupy, but one that brought him unexpected satisfaction. These children saw him not as the grief-stricken hermit he had been, but as the man he was becoming, someone who had stories worth telling and wisdom worth sharing. "Mr. Hale," young Tommy Henderson asked during a break in the music lessons, "is it true you fought Indians and outlaws when you were a soldier?" "I did," Barrett replied seriously, "but the most important battles I ever fought were right here at this ranch, defending my home and family." "With guns?" the boy pressed, his eyes wide with excitement. Sometimes with guns, Barrett admitted, but more often with patience, planning, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. As evening approached and the families departed for their various ranches, Barrett found himself alone with Miriam and Ruth for the first time in hours. They moved through the familiar routine of cleaning up after their guests, a domestic ballet they had perfected over months of practice. "I've been thinking," Barrett said as they settled in the great room for their customary evening conversation, "about making some changes to the ranch operation." Both sisters looked at him with interest. Barrett had been full of plans lately, his natural energy redirected from mere survival to active growth and improvement. "Joe Garrett is getting too old to manage all the day-to-day operations," Barrett continued. "I'm thinking of promoting him to ranch supervisor and hiring a younger foreman to handle the harder physical work." "That sounds wise," Miriam agreed. "Joe's earned the right to easier duties." "And I want to expand the horse breeding program," Barrett added. "There's growing demand for quality mounts, and we have the pasture and facilities to do it right." Ruth smiled from her chair beside the fireplace. "You're planning for the future again. It's good to see you thinking beyond just protecting what you have." Barrett considered her words, recognizing their truth. For 10 years after Margaret's death, he had lived in a state of defensive maintenance, protecting his grief as carefully as his property. The arrival of the Tisdale sisters had not erased that grief, but it had transformed it from a prison into a foundation, something to build upon rather than hide behind. "I've been thinking about something else, too," he said, his voice taking on a more formal tone that made both women look at him with renewed attention. "About making our arrangement here more permanent, more official." Miriam and Ruth exchanged one of their wordless communications, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in a glance. "What do you mean by official?" Miriam asked carefully. Barrett rose from his chair and walked to the mantelpiece, touching the frame of their family portrait. "I mean that this house has been a home again since you came here, and I don't want there to be any question about your right to stay, your place in this family we've created." He turned to face them directly. "I'm not talking about romantic love, we're all too old and too scarred for fairy tale endings. But I am talking about commitment, about legal recognition of what we've built together." Ruth's eyes widened with understanding. "You're proposing marriage." "I'm proposing family," Barrett corrected gently. "Marriage to one of you, legal adoption of the other as my sister-in-law, and formal recognition that you both have permanent claim to this place as your home." The sisters looked at each other again, then back at Barrett. "That's very generous," Miriam said slowly. "But it wouldn't be fair to Margaret's memory, or to our first husbands." Barrett shook his head gently. "Margaret would approve, and I think Jacob and Samuel would too. This isn't about replacing what we had, it's about honoring it by refusing to let grief stop us from caring for each other." Ruth rose from her chair and joined him by the mantelpiece, studying the photograph that captured their unlikely family. "You're talking about a marriage of convenience, of mutual protection and companionship." "I'm talking about a marriage of choice," Barrett replied. "We've chosen each other as family. Why not make it legal so that no one can ever question your right to be here?" Miriam joined them by the fireplace, her practical mind already working through the implications. "It would solve the property question permanently, and it would give us legal standing to continue the work we've started here. The piano lessons, the community gatherings, all of it." Barrett agreed. This house was meant to be filled with life and music and laughter. Margaret knew that, and she would want it to continue. They stood together in comfortable silence, three people who had found in each other what they needed to heal from their various wounds. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the valley that had become their shared sanctuary, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come. "Which of us?" Ruth asked finally, the practical question that needed addressing. Barrett smiled at her directness. "That's for you to decide between yourselves. The arrangement matters more than the specific details." The sisters conferred in their wordless way, a conversation conducted entirely through glances and subtle expressions. Finally, Miriam spoke. "Ruth should be your wife," she said firmly. "Music brought healing to this house, and she's the one who made that possible. I'll be honored to be your sister-in-law and Ruth's co-manager of the household." Ruth looked surprised. "Miriam, are you certain? You're the elder." "By 20 minutes." Miriam interrupted with a rare smile. "And you're the one who played Margaret's piano when no one else could bear to touch it. That took courage I'm not sure I possessed." Barrett felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched these two remarkable women sort out the details of their shared future with the same practical consideration they brought to everything else. This was not passion, but something perhaps more valuable, a deliberate choice to build something good together. "If we're going to do this," Ruth said, turning back to Barrett, "it should be done properly, a real wedding with the community invited, so there's no question about the legitimacy of our arrangement." "The church?" Barrett asked. "The great room," Miriam suggested. "This house has been the center of our healing. It should be the center of our celebration too." Over the following weeks, their unconventional wedding plans took shape with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized everything else they built together. The ceremony would be simple but dignified, conducted by the circuit preacher who visited Bear Creek monthly. The guest list would include their rancher friends, Ruth's piano students and their families, even Sheriff Donovan and his wife. The most important guests, however, would be the memories they carried Margaret's presence in the music that would accompany the ceremony. Jacob and Samuel's spirits in the courage their widows had shown in choosing love over fear, the knowledge that sometimes the best families are the ones we create rather than inherit. On a warm June morning in 1897, Ruth Tisdale became Ruth Hale in a ceremony that celebrated not just their marriage, but the triumph of hope over despair. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her still bright eyes, and Barrett wore his best suit with Margaret's wedding ring hanging on a chain around his neck knot hidden away, but worn as a reminder that love given freely never diminishes the heart's capacity for more. Miriam stood as matron of honor, officially becoming Barrett's sister-in-law and Ruth's partner in managing the household that had become the Valley's unofficial social center. The piano that had sat silent for 10 years provided music for the ceremony, played by Ruth herself as she walked toward her new husband and her new life. "Do you, Barrett Hale, take Ruth to be your wife, to love and protect and cherish for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Barrett replied, meaning every word despite their unconventional beginning. This was not the passionate romance of his youth, but something perhaps more precious, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the understanding that came from surviving loss. "Do you, Ruth Tisdale, take Barrett to be your husband, to love and honor and stand beside through whatever may come?" "I do," Ruth said, her voice clear and sure. She was choosing not just a husband but a future, not just security, but the chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. As they exchanged rings, new bands that would not replace their first marriages, but add to them, Barrett looked out at the assembled guests and realized that his fortress of solitude had truly become a home. The great room that had echoed with loneliness for a decade now rang with celebration, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. The formal photograph taken that day would join the others on the mantelpiece, but it would not be the last. There would be pictures of birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings, of piano recitals and community meetings, of the life they built together in the years that followed. Each image would tell part of the story of three people who chose to see possibilities rather than limitations, love rather than loss, hope rather than despair. As the evening celebration wound down and their guests departed for their various homes, Barrett found himself alone with his new wife and sister-in-law in the house that had finally fulfilled its original purpose. Margaret's dream of a home filled with life and love had been realized, just not in the way any of them had originally imagined. "No regrets?" he asked, as they settled into their familiar evening routine, only now with the added comfort of legal recognition for what they had built. "None," Ruth replied, her hand finding his with the easy affection of people who had chosen each other deliberately. "This is where we belong." Miriam nodded agreement as she banked the fire that would keep the house warm through the night. "Home isn't just a place. she said with characteristic wisdom. It's the people who choose to love each other despite everything the world might do to prevent it. Outside, the Wyoming wind continued its eternal song across the valley that had witnessed tragedy and triumph, loss and recovery, the ending of old stories and the beginning of new ones. Inside the stone lodge that had been built as a monument to one kind of love, 3 people settled into sleep knowing they had created something just as precious, a family forged by choice, strengthened by adversity, and blessed with the kind of contentment that comes not from avoiding sorrow, but from learning to find joy on the other side of it. The portrait on the mantelpiece caught the last light from the dying fire. 3 faces looking toward a future they would write together, one day at a time, with patience and courage, and the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and love freely given. It was not the ending any of them had planned, but it was the one they had earned, and it was enough.